right? So in today's class, let us study the architecture of a commercial database management system. Right. So let me start with the architecture diagram. Right. So this is the database system structure or architecture diagram of any commercial database management system. So so in the bottom tier you have disk storage components, right? So you have data, you have indices, data dictionary, statistical data, right? So the data file is used to actually store the data, right? So we have some data structures or we have some data files to store the data. And what do you mean by indices? So you all know index, right? Indices or index, they are used for quick and fast retrieval of data that is being stored in a databases, right? So data indices, they are used for quick and fast retrieval of data that is being stored in a database, right? So we also have data dictionary. So data dictionary is known as metadata. It contains data about the data that is being stored in the database. And we also have some statistical data, right? So whenever we have some data, we can perform some statistical operations on the data, right? So you can find sum of your particular column, average of your particular column, right? Average of your particular attribute or sum of your particular attribute, count of a particular attribute, max, min, right? So these are the statistical operations that can be performed on your data, right? So bottom tier, you have a data file to store the actual data. You have data indices that is used for quick and fast retrieval of data. Data dictionary, which is metadata that contains data about the data that is being stored in the database. You have statistical data, right? So you have some statistical functions that returns some statistical information about the data that is being stored in the database, right? So we'll study about even some working with some statistical operators in SQL, right? So for example, we can apply a lot of statistical operators like max, min, right? So max will return the maximum value for an attribute, min will return the minimum value for an attribute, right? Average, sum, count, right? So count will return the number of distinct values that is present for an attribute and so on. So these are the components that are available in disk storage, right? So if you look into the storage manager components, you have authorization and integrity manager, right? So what do you mean by authorization and integrity manager? So the functionality of authorization and integrity manager is that it checks for the authority of the user to access the data, right? So it checks the access right or authority of the user to access the data, and it also checks for integrity constraints that is to be enforced in a database, right? So authorization and integrity manager, it checks for the authority of the user to access a particular data, and it also enforces the integrity constraints in a particular database. And you have transaction manager, right? So what do you mean by a transaction manager? So it ensures that a transaction is going to be atomic. So a transaction manager ensures that a transaction occurs completely or not at all, right? So you know the atomicity property of a database, and atomicity property of your database is being enforced by this transaction manager. So it ensures that a transaction occurs completely or not at all, right? And then you have file manager, right? So the file manager, it deals with how to allocate storage for data in a particular file, right? And how to access the data, right? So it deals with the data structures that are used to represent the data, and how to store the data in a primary memory or in a secondary storage memory, You also have buffer manager, right? So the functionality of buffer manager is that it identifies what data has to be present in the cache memory or in the buffer, right? So what data has to be cached in the cache memory and what has to be present in the secondary storage device. So it can be dealt by this buffer manager, right? So in the top level, we have different types of users who are going to interact with the system by means of different interfaces, right? So for example, you have naive users, right? So naive users, they interact with the system by invoking an existing program that has been written previously, right? So for example, a bank, a teller, or a cashier, they may be interacting with the database system by invoking an existing program that has been written previously by some programmer. So they interact with the system by means of some user interfaces, application interfaces. They interact with the system, right? So naive users are the like bank tellers or agents who interact with the system by means of some form-based interface. They interact with the system by means of they interact with the system by invoking an application program that has been written previously. They are going to be naive users, right? Then we have this application programmers. So application programmers are the people who interact with the system, right, by having some DML calls that are embedded in some high-level programming languages, right? So they use application program as an interface to interact with the database, right? So you have some data manipulation language commands, DML commands embedded in host programming language, and you can interact with the database. They are known as application programmers. Sophisticated users, they interact with the system by means of a query-based interface, right? So like they use a structured query language to interact with the database. We call them as sophisticated users. And database administrators, they are in charge of backup and recovery operations of a particular database system. They are also concerned with the right. They give rights to the users to access a database, right? So they interact with the system by means of some administrative tools, right? So we'll also study in detail about DDL interpreter, DML compiler, and query evaluation engine, right? So to start with, this is the architecture of any commercial database management system, right? So bottom tier, you have disk storage components. Then you have the storage manager components. Then you have query processor components, followed by the different types of users who are going to interact with the system by means of different user interfaces, right?